Aristotle's Poetics is the earliest surviving of dramatic theory and first extant philosophical treatise to focus on literary theory. So, in this video we are going to focus on Aristotle's Poetics. In a very simple and lucid language, we'll try to cover it all. First, let's see his life and career. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE. He was a philosopher, poet, and a writer. By Aristotle, we mean the best purpose. He was born in a fluent family. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to King Mimesis of Macedon. And due to this reason, he had privilege of freedom to move inside the royal palace. Then, at the age of 18, Aristotle became disciple of Plato when he joined Academy of Plato. Later, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. And further, he also established his own academy at Athens and delivered lectures to his students. However, it is very interesting to know that his writing is not available to us in the original form, but only the notes written by his students are present. From this, we get the idea what Aristotle thought, believed, and propagated. In his personal life, he was married to Pythias. Later on, when Alexander died, the anti-Macedonian sentiments made Aristotle to flee to his mother's family estate. And few years later, he died in Euboea of natural cause. Now, all his works and studies reflect that he had an amazing passion for learning and possessed marvelous knowledge on multiple disciplines. His most important treatises include physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theatre, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government. By this, we get to know that his knowledge was so great, and that we can call him as Encyclopedia of Knowledge. And critics like Penny considered him first genuine scientist. Now, his view on poetry. His books, The Poetics, is a 26 chapters treatise and it deals with science of poetry and art of creating poetry. It is seen that Poetics has been the central document in the study of aesthetics and literature for centuries, especially during the Renaissance and in today's scholarly circles. Sidney too approved all the unities that Aristotle has talked about. But later, Johnson disagreed with them and said that certain unities were not necessary. So what is poetry to Aristotle? To Aristotle, poetry follows observation, then followed by analysis with tentative hypothesis, then drawing conclusion, and then giving recommendation on the art of creating poetry. To this, he gives a clear-cut definition, which he defines as poetry is nothing but medium of imitation that seeks to represent or duplicate their thought through characters, emotion, or action. Now, take for example, there is a small baby who does not know how to speak, but after living a considerable amount of time with his parents, he begins to imitate his parents, and after some time he will be speaking in a normal way. Similarly, here, Aristotle says that poetry is imitation of life, and this imitation of life is brought through poet. According to Aristotle, poetry emerges from human instincts, and this human instinct is brought out by poet. Poet is the creator, and the poet represents life through his sublime skill of observation. As shown here, first, poet observes like a first person in a subjective way. Subjective way in the sense linking emotion to the poetry. Or, he may also observe as third person in an objective way, which limits poetry to represent facts of the life. Or he might take another personality and watch the event as an observer. So this kind of poetry that emerges depend upon the nature of imitation. Like stated here, nature of imitation is followed by object, mode, and medium of imitation. So let me brief you about it. Object of imitation. The major object of imitation is man in action. Art imitates life by representing man as better than they are in the real life and with sublime qualities or as true to life as they are or worse than they are like low morals. And it is the real skill of the poet that enables him to present man differently from what they are and at the same time to be true to life. Then comes medium of imitation. A poet may represent life through rhythm, harmony, and language. For example, music. Music is an imitation of life through rhythm and harmony. Likewise, dance imitates characters, emotions, and action through rhythmical movements. And the last one, that is verse poetry. It is an example for imitation of life through language. And then comes mode of imitation. Mode of imitation follows through tragedy, comedy, and epic poetry. Similarly, depending on the mode of imitation, poetry can be classified into three types. As shown here, first is epic poetry, then tragedy, and third is comedy. According to Aristotle, epic poetry and tragedy consist the noble quality, whereas comedy consists the lower quality. The epic poetry or the tragedy gives pleasure to the reader as it depicts men are better than they are. Here, the reader identifies himself with the characters and feel better, whereas there are not much details available on the Aristotle's thought of comedy. However, like tragedy, he believed that comedy is to imitation of action but of lower status of man. In comedy, it is not the ugliness that is imitated, but the defects or weaknesses of the characters are imitated. So after reading a comedy, the reader laughs or enjoys the fun at the defects or the ridiculousness of the characters, and the reader feels happiness because it is not him that is presented. And at this point, the thought that he is better than the character makes him feel better. Further, Aristotle gives some similarities between epic poetry and tragedy. First, he says that both epic poetry and tragedy are the imitation of noble men in action. This means the nobleman or person, that is the hero, king, queen, or anyone who is related with authority, their deeds, tales, and sufferings are imitated in the epic or the tragedy. Then, both maintain unity of plot, which means the story they want to tell follows beginning, middle, and end. Then, in both epic and tragedy, the object of mimesis is similar subject. Means, whatever the story is conveyed through epic or tragedy, the main objective of it is to teach and to delight. Then both of them can be either simple or complex. For example, there can be a person who is very poor and then he can rise to become a very famous person. And in this process, his fortune may be followed by two processes. First is by simple, in which there are no sufferings, no struggles to achieve his aim, while there can be suffering and struggles to follow his aim. This results in the simple or complexity of the plot. Then, both contains 6 components. Now, these 6 components are related with tragedy, which contains a plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. Further, they also both in common have peripetia and anagnorisis. While peripetia means reversal of the fortune of the character, whereas anagnorisis means attainment of the knowledge. And lastly, all elements of epic poem are present in tragedy. But all elements of tragedy are not present in epic poem. Means epic poetry can come under tragedy, but tragedy cannot come under epic poetry. Now, having given some similarities, Aristotle also gives us some differences between epic poetry and tragedy. First, he says that the major difference is between the medium of expression. Epic poetry follows the language, whereas tragedy follows the action. So, language can be in the form of narration, and action can be in the form of performance on the stage. Next, the form employed in epic poetry is verse, and in tragedy is dramatic. Now here, verse in the sense poem, and dramatic in the sense in the form of dialogues. And as said earlier, the technique used in epic poetry is narration, and in the tragedy it is performance. The meter used in epic poetry is hexameter, that is, the poem that ends with 6 feet, and in tragedy it follows various meters. The device employed in epic poetry is imagination. Means in epic poetry, only imagination is required to arrive at the aesthetic pleasure, while in tragedy, music and spectacle helps in creating the aesthetic pleasure of catharsis. Just wait for a while to know its meaning. Now the time. The action in epic poetry has no limit, so therefore the content can be more lengthier and complex with more fantastic events, while in tragedy, action is confined to a single day, and this is because action over here is performed in front of the people, and this cannot go on continuously. Then, many incidents can take place simultaneously at different places and jumping forth and back in epic poetry, while in tragedy, the focus is on linear pattern, that is on the credibility and possibilities of the action. Then, the epic poetry can be appreciated in multiple settings, while the tragedy has to be appreciated in a single sitting. Because in epic, one can refer to the text as many times as he wants, but the tragedy that is being performed has to be admitted and appreciated in the single setting. Now, after discussing a lot about epic poetry and tragedy, having given the similarities and differences between them, Aristotle moves further to prove that tragedy is superior to epic. But how? Let's see it. First, he says that tragedy is for the lower level of people, means tragedy can be performed and it uses simple language, so that the lower people can understand it very easily, while epic poetry is for the higher level of people. It is difficult to understand and requires higher level of imagination. Also, it is narrated, and this requires high level of comprehension. Then, as stated back, tragedy has everything that an epic has, as discussed here. Along with this, the additional elements of music and spectacle in tragedy enables the audience to enjoy and appreciate tragedy, providing an indulgent pleasure, which is lacking in epic. Plus, it can be enjoyed in a single setting, and it is performed in a convincing manner close to life. And lastly, the aesthetic pleasure that is derived out of tragedy is of catharsis, which we have previously left it undiscussed. Now it's time to discuss it in a brief way. So catharsis, it is a medical term, that is catharsis, which means to clean or to wash, or purgation of emotion. Purgation in the sense pure, that is purity of emotion can be felt through catharsis. And this catharsis is achieved through tragedy. It relieves us of our own feeling of anger or stress through the various pleasure we get in watching some of the actions related to emotions, and this generates fear and pity. This is not something that is a spectacular thing, but it is about the inner structure. It affects our mind even if the tragedy is over at that moment. So, whatever a tragedy may be, the subject matter of it should be relatable to the audience to get the pleasure of catharsis. Now, Aristotle has discussed a lot of things about tragedy, about their origin, characteristics, concept, components, and many more. But due to shortage of time, we will discuss it in the next video. So don't forget to mark your presentee in the next video. So thanks for listening and see you in the next one.